Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has entered its third week. Russian forces are intensifying their operations. Major cities are being bombed relentlessly. Over the weekend, we witnessed a major escalation too. Russian jets flew close to the Ukraine-Poland border and destroyed a military base. Ukraine is making major claims. It says Russians used chemical bombs in Donbass, and an attempt is underway to replace the leadership in occupied territories. The Kremlin is sending a message to the West. It wants to end the war on its own terms. How will a divided NATO respond? So far, the West has only fed the violence with more weapons. Europe has become the biggest hotspot for weapons. Won't that make the continent a dangerous place? And what about the global economy? The sanctions are not just hurting the Russian economy, they could fuel the next global recession too. On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you the most comprehensive ground report from battleground Ukraine. I want to begin tonight with a video. Let me say this first. What you're about to see did not happen. But you must see it.
Let's see.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Oh merde. Oh mon Dieu. Viens voir, viens voir.
Fighter jets are invading France, dropping bombs all over Paris. A woman poses in front of the Eiffel Tower. Seconds later, explosions rock the city. Large plumes of smoke engulf Paris. There are air raid sirens, the sound of a child crying. None of this is real. But Ukraine's defense ministry has released this video with a message. Just think if this were to happen to another European capital. This is their message. And this message was addressed to NATO. What will they do if Europe is attacked? The hypothetical video was followed by a real attack. Russia struck at the doorstep of NATO. Multiple missile strikes hit Ukraine's border with Poland. The attack took place barely 25 kilometers from the Polish border, from Polish territory. NATO says it is a grave provocation. Russia says they asked for it. There are also reports of a possible chemical attack in Donbass. 2 Ukrainian mayors have been abducted. All of this is happening when Ukraine says there's quote-unquote progress in talks with Russia. So which way is this going? Is the war ending or is it escalating? On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you the latest from battleground Ukraine. We'll start with the Russian attack near the Poland border. The target was a Ukrainian military base in Yavoriv. Russian jets fired around 30 rockets at this facility. At least 35 people have died. This is a serious escalation. Russia in fact has taken this invasion right up to NATO's doorstep. The facility that was bombed hosted international NATO drills. So local lawmakers are now asking for NATO's help. They're making the same demand that Ukraine's president has been making. NATO should protect Ukrainian skies and shoot down Russian planes when they fly in.
That is why we keep asking NATO to close the sky, because to fight with an enemy who does not even enter Ukraine but launches a cruise missile, it is necessary to have a serious air defense system.
So that is the demand. Declare a no-fly zone, shoot down Russian planes. How is the West responding? The United States says NATO forces will be repositioned.
We continue to flow and to move and to reposition forces and capabilities along NATO's eastern flank to make sure that we can defend every inch of NATO territory if we need to. Now, there's no reason we should need to, because there's no reason that there should be war in Ukraine as it is. And we've made it very clear to Russia that NATO territory will be defended not just by the United States, but by our allies.
You heard him. NATO territory will be defended, says the U.S. For Ukraine, that means no help. Ukraine is facing a more aggressive Russian army now. Fighter jets were out of the battlefield so far. They're now becoming the weapon of choice for the Russians. Cities are being bombed relentlessly. We accessed a video today. It was shot by the Ukrainians. This is what it shows. The city of Mariupol, this is what it looked like after a Russian bombing campaign. Look at these images. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has issued a fresh warning. The Ukrainian president says the West was told about the Russian provocations last year itself and that the war will now spill into NATO territories.
I'll reiterate now that if you don't close our skies, then it's just a matter of time before Russian missiles will hit your territory, NATO's territory, and the houses of NATO citizens.
Differences between Ukraine and its Western allies are now out in the open. Just consider what Ukraine's foreign minister said today. Let me quote from his statement. To those abroad scared of being dragged into World War III, Ukraine fights back successfully. We need you to help us fight, provide us with all necessary weapons. The Russian invasion has entered its third week. According to multiple reports, Russia did not expect the war to last this long. Kiev believes Moscow is intensifying the attack. In fact, the government of Ukraine has made a big claim. It says Russia is using chemical bombs in Donbass. Over the weekend, a monastery was struck in eastern Donbass. 30 civilians were injured. Ukraine has reason to believe that Russia used a phosphorus bomb here. Now, these claims are yet to be independently verified, but remember, the US and Ukraine have been raising fears of a possible chemical attack since last week. Poland is feeling the heat. It wants NATO to do more. Polish President Andrzej Duda has spoken out. Let me quote from what he said. If he, that's Vladimir Putin, uses any weapons of mass destruction, then this will be a game changer in the whole thing. NATO, he says, would have to think seriously what to do, because then it starts to be dangerous, not only for Europe, but the whole world. There is another worry, the sudden disappearance of Ukrainian mayors. Russian forces have been accused of kidnapping them. 2 of them went missing over the weekend. In fact, in Melitopol, Russia has apparently installed a pro-Kremlin mayor. Her name is Galina Danilchenko. This week could decide the outcome of the conflict. Peace talks have resumed, but Russian forces are dangerously close to Kiev. Today, a Russian airstrike hit a residential building there. Zelensky is demanding a meeting with Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin is yet to respond. And here's something that I've said in the past. Truth is the first casualty of war, which is why you need journalists, independent journalists, to cover stories from battle zones. But this is easier said than done. Reporting from the front lines is never that simple. It's one of the most challenging assignments that any journalist can take. Your safety is not guaranteed. Neither are your basic supplies. But when you're out there, you're mostly on your own. The killing of an American journalist has come as a reminder of this grim reality. His name was Brent Renaud. He worked for the Time magazine. On Sunday, he was shot dead in Irpin. No one knows who killed him and why. His death has raised concerns about the safety of journalists stationed in Ukraine. What kind of challenges do they face in this war? What kind of risks do they have to overcome every day? Let's head straight to Kiev to find some answers, where my colleague Anas Malik has been reporting from, and he's been in Ukraine for more than a week now. Anas, take us through your experience so far. What is it like to be reporting on this war? Tell us about the kind of challenges that you faced as a reporter.
Well, Palki, thank you so much for having me. The first and foremost challenge is with regards to the language over here, because language remains as a bigger barrier to communicate. Then the second challenge is with regards to the accessibility of information and with regards to verification on ground. As journalists, we aspire to be on ground to as many areas as we can, and that's what the ultimate aim is. That's why we've been reporting from elsewhere, not just in Kiev, in Irpin. We've been reporting from Brovary, we've been reporting from Oblon and associated areas as near as to Kiev as they are. But the bigger challenge remains is how can you be safe in amidst that, because there's always that probability of being ambushed. We've seen that happening to different news crews you can be next as well. That's what happened as well yesterday when the Times photographer or video journalist was in a way we can say was shot dead at point blank in the neck, despite of the fact that his flak jacket and his helmet clearly said that it was press. Now the Ukrainian side says that it was done in Irpin by the Russian forces. I was in Irpin about 2 days back, and to just make you understand, there are two ways that goes towards Irpin beyond that bridge. One is towards the left, that goes towards Ostomil, Warzel and the other city, and the one on the right is considered to be safe. Brent was on the left side, which Ukrainian forces say that they have control of about 50 to 60%, and he had crossed one of the checkposts, and that from that point onwards the Ukrainian side had actually cautioned him. This is what local journalists or local sources tell me. That is one of the challenges, because you have to go there to get the story and not be the story yourself. Unfortunately, it was not the day for Brent, and he ended up being the story because of the indiscriminate firing that was allegedly done by the Russian side. Palki?
Anas, this is the second war that you're covering for WION in the last 6 months. You spent 3 months in Afghanistan in very challenging conditions. Now you're in Kiev with bombs falling left, right and center. When you hear reports of this, what goes through your mind? I know that for a journalist, the hunger for the story, for the best shot, for the most precise input is very, very important. But at the end of the day, every day you step out of your hotel, it's a matter of life and death.
If I just show you through, I'll answer your question. If I just show you through, those are sky trails of a rocket that has just been shot. I'm not sure if you can see that. Those are sky trails of a rocket that has just been shot. While you were asking this question, those are sky trails of the rocket that has just been shot. So to answer your question, you have to be safe. Yes. That is a priority, but you have to tell the story as well. Of course, there are challenges that are involved, and the bigger challenge is that you have a responsibility to deliver the truth, to be the voice of the unheard for a larger audience, for a bigger audience, because that is what our job is. You've rightly summed it up. There is that scare as well, that what happens, that I am the next casualty. But despite of that, we have this, as journalists, we have this responsibility to deliver the truth come what may. At times, some are not so lucky, but I've been. You've said it yourself that I've been covering. This is the second war that I've covered in a span of 6 months. This inherent fear remains. When I was leaving from my house, getting on that flight, getting here, this inherent fear remains. That what if I'm not back? But then you're contented and satisfied that at least I was doing something for the greater good. I was trying to be the voice of those who are unheard, and trying to show the world what the reality is on ground. And I think that to me, as a human being, that's what matters the most. The cost of war is that there is a humanitarian tragedy that is attached to it as well. Except for the emotional tragedy that is there, the humanitarian tragedy is there. Be that be in Afghanistan, be that be in Ukraine. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of families being relocated. If I just talk to you about Ukraine, in the past 19 days, 2.7 million people have been relocated. I crossed over from Poland into Ukraine. I was at the Medica border. I saw families literally lying out in the open, and they were being taken care of by the army of volunteers. Had it not been for them, then they would have been forced to spend their nights out in the open. Then, when I came to Ukraine, I went to Lviv. I saw a similar site in Lviv as well. That's in the western part. And here at Kiev, about 3 days back, we were reporting from there. We spoke to that family. That emotional goodbye between a couple that was there. She could not speak on the camera, but she told me that they hope to be there, to be reunited in time to come. But she still knows, she believes that this just might be the last hug. So that, as a human being, that does get to you, because that is what the emotional cost of war is, that you don't really know that the loved one that you are seeing, it might just be the last time. And as I said, you have a responsibility towards delivering the truth, and that is what we're here for. Palki?
Absolutely, Anas, and more power to you. I think in this day and age with social media around, it's very easy to dismiss what the media or the mainstream media does, what journalists do. They are the punching bag in every situation. But not many people appreciate, we ourselves don't sometimes appreciate the fact that people like you, reporters like you, are the unsung chroniclers of human tragedy, of our stories, and are documenting what's happening today for posterity. So thanks very much, Anas, for joining us, and stay safe. Both Ukraine and Russia are pursuing dual tracks. War on the ground, diplomacy on the phone. Until now, both fronts were stuck. The war is slow and painful, and so is diplomacy. But now there seems to be some progress. Today was the 4th round of direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. The first 3 were in-person talks. This one was over video call. Why was this round different? Because the sentiment in both camps was a lot more optimistic. Both Russia and Ukraine predicted success. Kiev said results could be achieved in days. Moscow hinted at a possible joint declaration, so the mood was buoyant. What about the results? Day 1 has ended. The talks will resume again tomorrow. Ukraine went in with 2 major demands. Number 1, an immediate ceasefire. Number 2, a withdrawal of Russian troops. Basically, end the war, and then we can talk politics. President Zelensky has an idea to fast-track diplomacy, a direct meeting between him and Vladimir Putin.
Representatives of our countries are holding daily talks via video conference. Our delegation has a clear task to do everything to arrange the meeting of the presidents. The meeting I'm sure people are waiting for. It's clear that it's a difficult story, a difficult path, but we need that path.
You can understand why Zelensky is desperate. His army has put up a great fight, but Russia's military superiority is coming through. The bigger question is this: why is Russia looking for talks? If he stays on the battlefield, Vladimir Putin wins. So why bother with talks at all? Well, we can think of 2 reasons. A, regime changes can be ugly business. You can swap the leaders, but not the public sentiment. A better option is to retain Zelensky, but on one condition, that Zelensky himself agrees to Russia's demands. And B, economic relief. Russia may win this war eventually, but until then, its economy will suffer. Soldiers, missiles, warships, all of it drains the Russian treasury. So Vladimir Putin will prefer talks to war. But where will they talk? Who will mediate? Turkey, we know, tried last week. They hosted foreign ministers from Ukraine and Russia. No luck. The talks ended without any progress. So a new mediator has emerged. Israel. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is the new peace broker, and Zelensky rates him highly. He wants Bennett to host Ukraine-Russia talks in Jerusalem. He wants Israel to guarantee Ukraine's safety. The question is Israel up for it? Well, over the weekend, conflicting reports emerged. Some said that Bennett was asking Zelensky to surrender, to accept Vladimir Putin's demands. But Israeli officials deny these claims. They say no such interaction took place. Either way, why is Naftali Bennett trying to mediate in the first place? France failed, Germany failed, Turkey failed. So what hope does Israel have? Frankly, it's a gamble by the Israeli Prime Minister. He leads a coalition government in his country. His credentials are constantly questioned at home. This mediation could change that. It could increase his political stature. Plus, Israel needs Russia's help in Syria. The Syrian airspace is controlled by Putin. Without his help, Israel cannot strike Iranian proxies. At the same time, Israel has an emotional obligation here. Remember, around 200,000 Jews lived in Ukraine before this war. Their president, Zelensky, is Jewish. So supporting Ukraine will appease Naftali Bennett's right-wing voters at home. But what if the mediation fails? That is the big worry for Israel. The US and Ukraine are piling the pressure on Bennett. They want him to sanction Russia. So far, Bennett has refused to buckle, but today he made a key concession. Israel's foreign minister promised to comply with international actions. What does that mean, complying with international actions? It means that Israel will not help Russia bypass the sanctions. It shows you how delicate the situation is, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for leaders like Bennett and Erdogan. The sentiments are good, the communication is clear, the last thing we need is an escalation. But that's exactly what NATO is doing. They have kicked off a massive military exercise in Norway. It's called Cold Response 2022. Just how big is it? 30,000 soldiers, 200 aircraft, 50 vessels. Now, these drills are held every year. But 2022 is not like every year. Russia is waging a war over NATO expansion. After days of fighting, there is some hope for diplomacy. And what does NATO do? Organize a massive military exercise. What's worse, Finland and Sweden have also joined these drills. Remember, Finland and Sweden are neutral countries. But this time, they're also participating. Did nobody tell NATO to read the room? Moscow has criticized the joint exercises. Here's what their embassy in Norway said. Any build-up of NATO military capabilities near Russia's borders does not help to strengthen security in the region. Now, just to be clear, nobody needs a security lesson from Russia. Their actions speak louder than their words. But why is NATO poking the angry Russian bear? Earlier this month, the US postponed a routine missile test. The idea was to de-escalate tensions. That was a wise choice. This military drill by NATO is not. Right now, all efforts should be made to silence the guns, to give diplomacy a chance. Deploying 30,000 soldiers in Norway is not going to achieve that. It will only make Vladimir Putin more paranoid. And that paranoia leads to preparation. More weapons, more defense systems, more fighter jets, anything that gives you a military edge. In simple words, an arms race. SIPRI has published a new report on global weapons trade. SIPRI is short for Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. They analyze military expenditure, basically who bought what. Now, their new report covers 5 years, from 2017 to 2021, 5 years. The biggest takeaway in this report is this. Europe is the new hotspot for weapons. Let me show you the numbers. In 5 years, the global weapons market shrank 5%, but Europe imported 19% more weapons. What explains this rise? According to SIPRI, Russia. That's the explanation. European states are wary of Russia's military aggression. Remember, this is 2021 we're talking about. Right now, the paranoia must be sky high. And their response was to buy more weapons, to expand their arsenal. 3 countries spent the most: Britain, Norway, and the Netherlands. Who benefited from this arms race? The United States. That should tell you something. In 2017, they made up 32% of global weapons supply. In 2021, 39%. Most European states prefer to buy American weapons. Britain, Norway, and the Netherlands ordered 71 F-35 jets. Finland ordered 64, Poland 32, and today Germany ordered 35. What does all of this tell you? The war may have started in 2022, but the preparations began 5 years back, and all of this money is going to the US. Where does Ukraine figure on this list? Surprisingly, very low. You see, military imports depend on your economy. How much money can you spare for weapons? And Ukraine's economy cannot spare very much. Most of their weapons come from two sources. One, the weapons they inherited from the Soviet Union, and two, the military aid from the West. The first one, the Soviet weapons, include the expensive toys like fighter jets or missile systems. The second one is not as expensive. Since 2014, the United States has sent military aid worth $2.5 billion to Ukraine, $2.5 billion. And that's a lot of money. Just last week, Joe Biden sanctioned another $200 million. So the weapons are flowing. But what kind of weapons are these? Mostly small missiles. Around 17,000 pieces were shipped immediately after the war broke out. These are handheld weapons, basically point and shoot. On paper, these shipments make sense. Russia has 5 times more tanks than Ukraine, 9 times more warplanes, so Ukraine cannot win a direct battle. They need a force multiplier, something to level the playing field. In this case, that multiplier is small weapons. Take a look at what NATO has shipped to Ukraine so far. Stinger anti-craft missiles, Javelin anti-tank missiles, snipers, night vision goggles, portable surveillance radars. What's common about all of these weapons? They're typical insurgency arms. Just think about it. NATO has limited their assistance to small weapons. Poland offered to send jets. America said no. Ukraine asked for the Iron Dome system. Again, America said no. So we must question NATO's intention here. Do they want to help Ukraine win? Or do they just want to hurt Russia? And in this case, these two things are not the same. Think back to the Soviet war in Afghanistan. America flooded the country with weapons. They provided Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. Those missiles changed the tide of the war. But what happened when the war ended? The Soviets packed up and left, and so did the US. They had no interest in toppling the Soviet-backed government. Their goal was to bleed the Soviet Union, to give Moscow their Vietnam. And that mission was accomplished. Could something similar happen in Ukraine? You cannot rule it out. Reports say the West is planning a government in exile, possibly in Poland. If Kiev falls, Zelensky and his ministers could shift there. Zelensky gives nominal leadership. The volunteers keep fighting Russia on the ground. It is certainly possible. There is no exact record of the weapons flowing into Ukraine as we speak. We know shipments are arriving. We know how much they're worth, but we do not know what is inside. How many Stinger missiles? How many snipers? Vladimir Putin also realizes this. He knows the Ukrainian people will not accept a puppet regime. There will be opposition and some stingers. Add some stingers, and you have a full-blown insurgency in Ukraine. The immediate worry is the fate of the global economy. The punishing sanctions will turn Russia into global economic pariah. But how will it impact the rest of the world? For instance, what happens to Russia's external borrowings? If Moscow cannot pay its creditors, there could be a financial meltdown. And this meltdown will not be limited to Russia. Banks in the US and Europe are also exposed to Russian bonds. This report tells you how a Russian default would play out.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has disrupted the global economy. Stock markets are reeling. The price of oil continues to fluctuate. Western sanctions have had a deep impact. Moscow is staring at a default. This week, Russia must pay its creditors at least $117 million. The deadline is Wednesday. Russia has the money to pay, but it cannot use it. Russia had more than $640 billion in its reserves before the war. The sanctions have cut off access to half of it. That's around $300 billion. Russia says it can make the payment in rubles. That's the Russian currency. But the bond contractors prevent Moscow from doing that. The payment must be made in dollars. A default looks imminent. World Bank's chief economist Carmen Reinhart says Moscow is mightily close to one. Ratings agencies like Moody's and S&P have downgraded Russian bonds. They have been labeled as junk. The Russian Finance Ministry says the West is engineering an artificial default. Western powers are punishing Russia's economy for invading Ukraine. But sanctions cut both ways and threaten Western economies too. Russia's external liabilities stand at about $480 billion. Out of this, $135 billion is used to creditors this year alone. Corporate debt is another worry. Russian entities owe more than $121 billion to international banks. Major countries have exposure to Russian debt. Banks in the United States are owed almost $15 billion. European banks need to be paid $84 billion. In this pile, France, Italy and Austria have the maximum exposure. Who will suffer the losses if Russia fails to pay? Leading international banks will lose money. We're talking about names like Goldman Sachs. As of December 2021, it had an exposure of $650 million. Citigroup is owed around $10 billion. French bank Société Générale needs to be paid almost $21 billion. BNP Paribas invested both in Russia and Ukraine. It is owed more than $3 billion. Credit Suisse is owed more than $1 billion. In 2008, the global economic crisis began with defaults at major banks. 14 years later, the sanctions on Russia are raising fears of another recession. Inflation is already rising. In the US, inflation is at the highest in 4 decades. In the Eurozone, inflation is already touching 6%, which is a record high. The West is mulling more sanctions on Russia. It must brace for the fallout on the global economy.
What Putin needs right now is a friend, a powerful friend, someone who can support him financially and militarily. The obvious candidate is China. Reports say Putin has already reached out. Russia wants China to supply military equipment. At first glance, it makes perfect sense. NATO is flooding Ukraine with weapons, so why should Russia not do the same? For starters, the equation is different. Ukraine cannot fend for itself. It needs Western weapons to fight Russia. That's not the case with Putin. His military is far more powerful than Ukraine, so technically he does not need Chinese weapons. He will win with or without them. Also take a look at some numbers. 77% of China's total weapons imports come from Russia. China makes up 18% of Russia's total weapons export. What do these numbers tell you? That China buys from Russia, not the other way around. So we must read these Western reports with some caution. Having said that, would Putin love to get some Chinese weapons? Of course he would. Not because he needs them to win the war, but to solidify his partnership with Beijing. Now, until now, Beijing has taken a cautious approach. They have refused to condemn Russia. At the same time, they're calling for dialogue. They've refused to join Western sanctions. At the same time, they did not back Russia at the United Nations. They abstained. So clearly, there are limits to China's friendship. Military support would suspend those limits. It would signal a fully committed partnership. And the US is trying very hard to prevent that. Let me quote what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said about China helping Russia. We will not allow that to go forward, he says, and allow there to be a lifeline to Russia from these economic sanctions from any country, anywhere in the world. So Washington is quite clear. If you help Russia, you will face consequences. That is their message to the world. You will be caught in the crossfire. How does China see this threat? As part of America's disinformation campaign, this is what they said.
Recently, the US has been spreading disinformation against China in regards to the Ukraine issue, time after time, with sinister intentions. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear, and we have always played a constructive role in persuading peace and promoting talks. It is imperative that all parties exercise restraint, de-escalate tensions rather than exacerbate them, and push for a diplomatic solution rather than further escalating the situation.
It's really a question of priorities. China's vision is clear. They want to compete with the US and eventually they want to beat America. In that context, supporting Russia is a risk. Chinese companies could face sanctions. Their trade with the West could be affected. Is the relationship with Russia worth it? If yes, then China will openly help Vladimir Putin. If not, then China's support will be notional. And it's not just China. Most Russian partners have to take that call, even India. Moscow is offering crude oil at a discount rate for India. Reports say New Delhi is considering the offer. Now, financially, it makes sense. Oil prices are up almost 40% internationally. India's import bill is set to rise by $50 billion in the next fiscal year. So cheaper oil is always welcome. But what about the politics? Will this move alienate the United States? There are no indications so far. In fact, the Pentagon is keen on selling more weapons to India. On Saturday, a top US admiral was testifying before Congress. He was asked a straightforward question. What more can the US do to build a partnership with India? Here's what he replied. Continue the information sharing, continue to support them with the equipment they need upon the line of actual control, and continue to partner and operate together throughout the region. Basically, stay with India. Ideally, it shouldn't matter. Europe is still buying Russian gas, so why shouldn't India buy Russian oil? Surely the rules have to be the same for everyone. Unlike China, India does not have nefarious designs here. It's about staying neutral, buying affordable oil, and consistently demanding a peaceful resolution. We've not heard the last of this story. We'll keep tracking. But away from the conflict of Ukraine, tensions between Iran and Israel are also growing. Instead of fighting each other directly, they're settling scores in different countries. Last week, Israel allegedly struck an Iranian camp in Syria and killed 2 Iranian soldiers. On Sunday, Iran retaliated. It landed 12 missiles on the city of Erbil in Iraq. The targets were what Iran calls spying centers controlled by Israel. Iraq does not agree. It's accusing Iran of violating its sovereignty. It's a very complex story. Our next report tries to break it down for you.
Sunday, the 13th of March. It's the middle of the night in Erbil, the capital of Iraq's Kurdistan region. Suddenly, a barrage of missiles rained down on the city. They land near a sprawling consulate complex owned by the United States of America. The offices of a Kurdish TV channel are also damaged. A total of 12 missiles hit the city. They light up the night skies. The explosions are heard from miles away. The Kurdish police spring into action. They rush to the site immediately, fearing an all-out terror attack. By the time they reach, the attacks stop. All that's left are damaged cars and window panes. Minutes later, the Iranian state media airs this broadcast, claiming all responsibility for the attack.
در پی جنایات اخیر رژیم جعلی صهیونیستی و اعلان قبلی مبنی بر بی‌پاسخ نگذاشتن جنایت‌ها و شرارت‌های این رژیم منحوس دیشب مرکز راهبردی توطئه و شرارت صهیونیست‌ها مورد هدف موشک‌های قدرتمند و
So who are the attacks aimed at? The United States, the government of Iraq, or the Kurdish rebel movement? None, says Tehran. It claims the targets were 2 strategic centers run by Israel. Why? Apparently to avenge the killing of 2 Iranian soldiers. Last week, 2 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed in an alleged Israeli airstrike in Damascus. The IRGC had vowed to make Israel pay for their deaths. The attack on Erbil was aimed at achieving that retribution. Iraq and the United States, however, don't see it that way. They are calling it a serious escalation. Iraq's Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi has called the attack a violation of Iraq's sovereignty. He has urged Tehran not to make Iraq a stage for settling external scores. The United States has echoed these statements. America's National Security Advisor says the attack was unjustified and Iran will be held accountable. How is Iran responding to these warnings? its foreign minister says Tehran will not ever tolerate Iraq becoming a center for sabotage and conspiracy.
It is not at all acceptable that one of our neighbors that has deep relations with us becomes a center for creating threats against the Islamic Republic. Iran will not tolerate that a center near its borders becomes the center for sabotage, conspiracy, and for sending terrorist groups to Iran.
So what happens next? What consequences will this attack have, besides the fact that it may lead to an Israeli retaliation? This attack also risks the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal. For at least 10 months now, Western diplomats have been negotiating with Tehran to revive the deal. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine complicated their efforts. Moscow is a key negotiator in the talks. It wanted assurances from the West that their sanctions will not affect its ties with Tehran. The West refused to agree, so Russia pulled out of the talks and the negotiations were halted. This was last Friday. Over the weekend, Iran's attack on Erbil, the fact that it rained missiles on a foreign city, could give Western leaders more reason to not revive the talks. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Meanwhile, China is grappling with a new Wuhan virus outbreak. It is reporting thousands of new cases every day. As many as 10 cities in China are under lockdown. In the West, Europe is reporting a big spike. New infections are on the rise in at least 5 countries. Are we looking at another global wave of the Wuhan virus? Our next report has the numbers.
China's latest Wuhan virus outbreak is getting bigger. Chinese tech hub of Shenzhen is the latest victim. A partial lockdown has been announced. Most businesses have been closed. All of the city's 17 million residents will now undergo a test. They aren't the only ones who are suffering. China is facing its worst outbreak in 2 years. As many as 10 cities in China are under a lockdown. 20 of the 31 provinces have confirmed infections. Like always, data on daily cases seems like an undercount. Officially, China reported just over 2,000 new cases today. Omicron has exposed the weaknesses of China's zero-COVID strategy. The Communist Party's local leadership is struggling to contain new infections. Already, some officials have been dismissed. The mayors of Jilin and Jiutai have been shown the door. Beijing didn't specify why they were dismissed, but in both regions, new infections are rapidly expanding. The outbreak in Hong Kong still remains a matter of concern. The city still remains in the grips of a deadly Omicron surge. In recent days, Hong Kong has reported the highest daily death toll in the world. The Wuhan virus is spreading fast among the most vulnerable. 70% of all elderly homes are now dealing with an outbreak. Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam still doesn't want to impose a lockdown.
For the time being, I would say we are not thinking of increasing social distancing measures because the current social distancing measures in place are already the toughest in 2 years. I have to consider whether the public would accept further measures. So we would not just casually roll out further social distancing measures. But still, I want to appeal to people. Now is not yet the time to let down our guard.
China is now the biggest hotspot in the east. Another wave of infections are sweeping the West, too. Europe is quickly becoming a hotspot. The United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland and Italy, they all reported an upswing in new cases last week. In Austria, the Netherlands and Switzerland, more than 3,000 people are testing positive per 1 million. There is a spike in hospitalizations, too. In Ireland and the United Kingdom, more than 100 patients are being admitted for every 1 million citizens. What's driving the surge in Europe? Is it Omicron or a new variant? It is difficult to say. But a new variant of the virus has been detected in France. It is called Deltacron. This variant is a hybrid of the Omicron and Delta variants. There is not enough data to fully understand Deltacron, but the world needs a virus surge.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas Images. Thanks very much for watching.